Hey friends, welcome to Bokeh, a podcast exploring the ever-blurring lines between the personal and business lives of professional photographers. This is your host, Nathan Holritz, and I'm happy that you can join me today in connecting with photographers and entrepreneurs as we discuss photography, business, and, oh yeah, that sometimes messy thing that we call life. This podcast, it's brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com. All right, Bokeh Podcast listeners, we're here for yet another episode of the Bokeh Podcast, and I'm joined by really, I would say, a new friend of mine. I'm here with Laylee, and Laylee, pronounce your last name for us. So we get
Emadi.
This Emadi. I want to make sure we get that absolutely right. We're here at the United Conference in Phoenix, Arizona, and we're going to have a conversation about burnout, which is something that you're, should we say, passionate about? I know that's kind of a cliche term these days, but
I'm so passionate about it. I would definitely say that I'm passionate about burnout, or preventing burnout, technically.
Exactly, which I really love. We've talked about the idea of burnout in the past here at Bokeh, but today we're going to be a bit more preemptive in nature, and that we're going to talk about how to avoid that to begin with. It's one thing to learn how to deal with it once it happens, but ideally we avoid it. And I love this topic because it's very much a reflection of what Bokeh is about. We talk about saving time, working efficiently, ultimately, so we have a life. And of course, that's very much what Photographers Edit is about as well. So I'm excited about this. We're going to get into that in just a little bit. But just to begin with, something that we talk about, speaking of time, at the Bokeh Podcast, is this idea of how to create space for ourselves. And if our listeners chime in and they only listen for a few minutes, I want them to still walk away with something of value. So how do you create space in your life, whether that's for yourself or other things that you want to do in business? How do you create time for yourself?
I think it's really important to actually take an overall look at your months, year, days, and kind of break down time in that manner so that you're making sure that you don't. I think a lot of us will make time for ourselves maybe 1 hour at a time, or we'll look at one day and say, okay, well, I'm going to make time for myself today. And then 2 months later, you haven't ever revisited it. So I like to block off a certain number of days per month. And I actually have a year at a glance calendar that I use. And I that's the first thing I do at the beginning of every year is I block off those days.
So when you're looking at these, how do you plan that far in advance? I guess that would be kind of a challenge. For a lot of photographers, the idea of planning that far in advance could be a little bit complicated. Are you planning your schedule based simply on the upcoming shoots that you have, or what points are you looking at?
Yeah, so for me, I have made a huge shift in my life, and this is what I talk about whenever I'm teaching on preventing burnout is no matter what happens in my schedule, I block those days and I honor those days that I block. So I know that a lot of times for wedding photographers, it's difficult because you want to give your whole weekend to your weddings, and that's fine. So then you block off like maybe 2 Wednesdays a month, and you have to honor those. And I know that sometimes opportunities can come up, and if you can maybe swap it out for another day, then you do. But if I can't swap it out for another day, then I turn down those opportunities, and that's what keeps me going.
Really? Okay, so when you're talking about blocking these days out, then you're specifically talking about time for yourself.
Yes.
And is it usually one day a week or a couple of days a week, or what does that look like?
So for me, when I block off at a year in advance, like that far in advance, I'll do 1 day a month. But when I look at my month before it starts, I add in 1 day a week.
Okay.
So I'm taking at least 1 day a week strictly for myself. And that actually means to me, it's not a day for my husband, and it's not a day for my family, and it's not a day for my friends. It's strictly a day for me.
Really?
And that could mean it could be a day for me to read a book. It doesn't have to be business free. Like I could be reading a book on business, or I could be, I'm not even saying you have to go on a spa day. I could just be at home. I feel like there are no parameters that keep me from enjoying that day. I just know that that's a day of freedom that waits for me in the times of high stress, in the times of never-ending workflow situations where I know that day just waits for me to be able to breathe.
Okay. And I mentioned to you before we got started, I kind of wanted to dig into the psychology behind why this is such a big deal to you. And I'm sure there's an interesting story or series of stories there. So we'll get to that in just a bit. But we talked about the idea of being preemptive. I love that you're planning these days off in advance. And I think it's something that we could all stand to do. I found myself, as much as I talk about this very thing, this working efficiently, creating space for ourselves, having a life outside of just work, I still, even as of late, I've been quite busy. And so that that idea of taking time for myself, or even just setting space aside for my kids to give them focused time, or my significant other, that's something that's become a little bit more, I should say, convoluted, not complicated, because ultimately it's on us to do it, right? We just have to do it. But I love the preemptive action that you've taken in this case for that. And we'll get into a little bit more why and how to do that effectively here in just a bit. But that free time, if you have a day off, how do you like to spend it?
Oh gosh, that for me is like, I could go on and on for this, but I guess on average, what I love to do with my free time is pick up either like a really great book, or, honestly, like I'll binge watch TV, or I'll take time. Sometimes there are days that I set aside to spend with my family and friends, and I like to go meet up for coffee, and then I'll usually actually get there a little bit early and, get an extra latte and take a book. And I really just try to embrace like the freedom and the time where I'm not obligated to be responsible to anybody else. And so I guess the way that I spend my time is that I don't put any kind of schedule on for that day.
Okay.
I just kind of go with the flow, and where the day takes me, it takes me. And it's a very new thing for me. So and it's
you
been
seem
in
like
the
a
past
naturally
year.
structured person.
I'm
Are you?
very type
so
A.
The idea of like not having structure in that day and not being in control, if you will, of what's going on, just kind of going with the flow. That's kind of good for you, right?
It's been an uphill battle, but it's been incredible. This past year, starting around this time last year, is when I started to actually attempt this. And for me, the first 6 months that I did this, I felt an extreme guilt anytime I didn't have something on my calendar. And so I would structure these. I would take these days off, and there would be no structure. And the lack of structure made me feel guilty that I was away from my business, or that I was like not pouring into my family or friends. And I was like, this is selfish. This is self-serving. And I have come to find now that that's like the opposite of true.
And you see significant benefit from that, I'm sure.
So much benefit.
And we'll probably talk about this a little bit more, but what would you say is one of the primary benefits that you get from having that space?
I honestly feel healthier. And I say that in terms of mental health and stress and anxiety. I carry stress really heavily. And so I found that it physically takes a toll on me. And so I feel physically better when I make time for myself, and it's time that is completely unstructured, and it doesn't have to be a lot of time. Like I said, it could be a day, it could be an afternoon. It doesn't even have to be a full day. But having that just sense of, it's almost like a breath of fresh air. That's like the best way I can describe it, is that I can breathe better. And so I feel like the weight has been lifted off my shoulders, and all the tension that I'm holding like up in my back and up in my shoulders, like I can feel it physically drain away. And it's incredible.
That's really, really cool.
Yeah.
You mentioned books. Do you have a favorite book or type of book even that you like to read? What's a book that's been extremely impactful? Maybe even as of late or of all time? I don't know if you have like a top 3 or something, but like what's the most impactful book that you've read as of late?
Oh my gosh, it's so hard because I love reading, and I'm a little bit embarrassed, but I will admit that I read like some trashy novels from time to time. So those are like my fun days
Speaking
off.
of the mental break, right?
Yes, those are my mental break books.
Yeah.
But the most impactful book I think that I've read lately is Brené Brown's Braving the Wilderness. And it just was amazing. It provides a lot of perspective, especially in an industry like ours. It's really an incredible read, especially if you're trying to navigate a sense of belonging, or feeling like you don't necessarily fit the mold of society. And for me in particular, it's been really good to reflect on in our industry, where I feel like a lot of times we feel like we need to look like everybody else, and our business needs to look like everybody else's. So that's been a really great read.
What do you think it is? And we just heard Jasmine Starr speak at one of the meetings earlier, one of the sessions earlier, and she was talking about that craving that we all kind of have to fit in. And that's particularly true in the photography industry. We're all looking at each other's Instagram accounts, and we want to be like this person and that person. What do you think drives that? I
honestly think it is 100% social media. Because if you think about, for me, when I look back on how I've always had a sense of wanting to belong.
I think it's a natural human thing.
It is absolutely a natural human thing, but I think it's been accelerated, and I think it's been just made a lot more extreme with how aggressive social media has become, because we have access to everybody else's lives 24/7. Whereas before, we might feel a little bit less than, or a little bit more of a craving to belong at things like, conferences or when you're younger, school, and that only takes up a few hours of your day.
Yeah.
But now it's taking up 24 hours of our day if we let it, and
Yeah.
it just gets to be so draining.
How do you avoid it? How do you personally avoid it?
I have struggled with this, and I will be the first to admit I have not yet perfected this art, but I've tried to set limits on how often I actually spend looking at other people's feeds. I'm not a fan of the unfollow. I'm not a fan of, okay, this person doesn't make me feel the best, so I'm not going to follow them anymore. I don't really think that helps. I think that's hiding a problem.
Yes.
So I think you find inspiration and you find motivation to look at other people's lives in a positive way and not in a comparative, almost, I don't want to say the word malicious because I think it's a little bit extreme, but I almost think that if it gets to that point at where resentment builds towards others, it can become malicious, and it can become to the point where people are saying, oh, well, if they had to go through what I'm going through, and not that anybody would, intentionally put ill thoughts into somebody else's life.
Sure.
But it's an unintentional thing, I think, that builds from resentment. So I think just taking a step back and taking breaks where you put your phone away and you get out a book, or you turn on the TV if you're not a big reader, or you go for a walk, and you just leave your phone at home. It's really hard.
It is hard, but man, there's such a relief innate to that.
Absolutely.
As well. I love it. I mean, my phone is a significant part of what I have to do as an entrepreneur, but not having to have it all the time is just wonderfully freeing too. Even if I ride motorcycles, so I jump on a motorcycle and I have this little mount that I can put my phone on in front of me on the bike, so I can keep, I can use it for the GPS,
right.
Or I know if I'm out, my kids are at home, if a message comes in from them, at least aware of the fact that they tried to reach out to me. But sometimes it's nice to just ride and not even think about that.
Keep it tucked away in your pocket
100%,
or your bag. Yeah.
Actually take a break, right?
Yes.
So it's so important to do that. I'm glad that you bring that up. Switching gears just a little bit, though, tell us something totally random about you that maybe most people wouldn't know, just going to read your bio on your website or something. What's something totally random?
I guess something totally random would be that this is actually photography, and owning my photography business is actually my third or maybe fourth career.
Really? What else have you done?
I worked in marketing.
Okay.
Straight out of college. I moved to London and I worked for a publishing company.
Wow.
And I was in their marketing department.
Okay.
And then when I moved back to the States, I worked for a mortgage servicing company doing research. And then I was a full-time teacher for about 7, 8, almost 8 years before I went full-time into photography. I started teaching 10th grade pre-AP English and coaching the dance team.
Really? What kind of dance?
A little bit of everything.
Okay.
So in Texas, dance is huge in schools because we have football. So the halftime pom squad type thing. It's called drill team actually, but it's dancers.
Okay.
So I did that, and then I ended up leaving the traditional classroom and teaching dance at a public school all day, every day, and coaching their dance team as well.
Do you miss that?
I miss it so much.
It seems like it'd be amazing. And I had the opportunity to teach photography just to a couple of classes. It was in a pre-career school. What do they call it? There's a technical term for that, kind of like a career prep academy. Anyway, in high school, juniors and seniors. And so these kids are, first of all, they're opting to take this line of classes or this particular class. So they actually are interested in what you have to say. And they're old enough where you can engage them basically like adults.
Absolutely.
And the conversation was really enjoyable. And that environment, to teach in that environment was really, really enjoyable. Mm-hmm. Do you enjoy it because of the age group? Do you enjoy it because of the subject, a combination of the above?
A little bit of both.
Okay.
I grew up dancing, and so I used to teach dance at studios. So teaching it at public school was really amazing because you're able to give the opportunity to take those classes to kids that maybe wouldn't be able to afford it or didn't have the option growing up.
Sure.
So being able to work, and the age group for me was very important. I think any teacher you talk to, if you teach elementary, you think high school teachers are insane.
Right.
And if you teach high school, you think elementary school teachers are like saints and angels sent from above.
Right.
Like, I could never do that.
Yeah.
So I miss it every day, but I actually have the opportunity to go back and I choreograph for a lot of the local high school dance teams in my area.
That's
so
cool.
I still get to see them. I still get to work with them. And that's why I primarily work with high school seniors as a photographer.
Okay, that makes sense. Well, and speaking of, I'm curious if you'll share just briefly your background in photography. How did you get into it? Because you have all these other careers and you choose to change yet again and do this. What's the backstory there?
Yeah, so actually I started with my students. I started taking dance photos of them just for fun. I always loved photography as just a hobby, the way that a lot of us do growing up. And I actually think I got it from my mom, who every time she had a camera would be taking pictures of flowers and grass and like anything around her. And I always saw a passion in her for that. So being able to kind of pick it up as a hobby was great. And then working with my students was amazing. And I love building their confidence. And I think that was one of the main tenets of what I wanted to do as a classroom teacher. So being able to do that behind the camera, we would have a project every year where we would have, it was inspired by Jordan Matter, who's a photographer, and he has a book called Dancers Among Us. And it's this whole series of dancers in everyday situations. And so I modified that into a lesson plan for my kids.
Really?
And we would go around the school and take dance portraits all around the school, doing like really fun stuff. And that kind of turned into some of them asking me to take their high school senior portraits. And it turned into them paying me with, it never was an intention for it to become a career. It just kind of blossomed, and I found a love for it. And you'll hear a little bit more about this when we start talking more about burnout, but leaving teaching was the hardest thing I've ever done.
Okay.
But, having my career start within my classroom, I think was just a really special and important thing for me to always remember when I'm running my business too.
How long ago was that you made that jump? And then how long did it take you to go full-time from teaching into photography?
I have been full-time for, I want to say, a little bit over 3 years now.
Okay.
And I started my business about 6 years ago.
Okay.
So I think it took me about 3 or 4 years, including like the times that it was just a fun hobby, to go full-time. And again, that was really never my intention. Spoiler alert, I burnt out.
And we're going to get to that. Talk to us about what type of photography. You mentioned senior photography earlier. Does that tie into your brand position? What is your photography business's brand position? Or more specifically, what sets you apart from other photographers in your market?
Yeah, so I do. I work primarily with high school seniors and dancers.
Okay.
And then I am also a wedding photographer. But I feel like in terms of my brand and my brand position, I work to empower and encourage and build confidence in every client that I work with.
Interesting.
So I really limit the number of weddings that I take on.
Okay.
I used to only take up to 5. This year I went up to 10, and next year I'm going back down to 5. I try to be really selective in the types of people that I work with, only because I feel that one of my strongest assets is being able to pull out confidence from those who need just a little bit of extra help.
Okay. Yeah.
And so just empowerment, encouragement, and confidence, I think is my main brand position.
That's interesting. Okay. How do you effectively communicate that, though? Because I can't imagine that the average individual who's looking for a photographer is going to go looking for a photographer who specifically enables those types of feelings, right? It's ultimately what that is helping somebody else feel better about themselves, empowered, enabled. Do you put that on your website? How do you communicate that? I don't. And it's really interesting because I don't even think that I knew that I was doing this until about a year and a half ago. I had a bride come to me. It was actually her and her mom came to the consultation, which is not uncommon, but typically I get just a bride or a bride and groom. Right.
So this was a bride and her mom, and they said that they found me because they had done their engagement photos with another photographer, and the bride just said she didn't feel confident, and she said that she saw in all of the portraits of my high school seniors. She hired me based off of my senior work for her wedding. Okay. And it was through that conversation that I found that even with my couples, that's what I strive to provide for them is that extra level of confidence. And in general, I think that my referral-based wedding business has come from a lot of the grooms saying that I made them feel comfortable in front of the camera. And a lot of them have made comments, my brides have made comments like, oh, I love that I see all types of brides and grooms in all of your work. I'm not just seeing, the cover of Vogue every time I look at your work. Yep. And yet all of them look so beautiful, and they look so happy, and they look so just joyful. And I think that to me speaks more about what I offer than if I were to just tell them that I'm here to empower you and I'm here to make you feel like $1,000. Like, I think that's something that everybody could say. Right.
It's very, very true. Effectively communicating that would be a difficult thing. The images probably communicate a certain feeling certainly your clients can probably speak to the experience that they've had with you when they're referring you to their friends, their family, or otherwise. This is interesting, though, and it really could be a podcast episode of itself. In fact, maybe we'll have to do another one at some point, but is there a particular thing or things that you do, if you could just explain it briefly, to help those clients feel more comfortable, not only with you, but also with themselves?
I think that, and I hesitate to say this in this way, but I'm just going to put it on out there and be really real about it.
Okay.
I have a little bit of a self-deprecating humor.
Okay.
And so I think just, I feel like in order for people to have permission to fully embrace who they are and be themselves and allow themselves to feel comfortable, they have to see you feel comfortable first.
100% makes all the difference in the world. Yeah.
Does that make sense?
Yeah. Absolutely. No, that's really, really good. The other thing, too, and I'm curious about this, because as you were talking, I was thinking about the level of energy. In fact, so for those of you listening in, we're sitting outside right now. That's why you're hearing a lot of background noise. And we have 2 or 3 different live shoots going on right now. We've got models, photographers that are leading these shoots. And one of the things that tends to happen a lot when we go to these workshops or conferences and you see shoots happen is that photographers will not talk. They'll shoot. They won't talk. What do you do to kind of communicate a certain level of energy with your clients as you're photographing them? Because they're not used to having that camera pointed at them, unlike a model who may be used to it. How do you translate a positive energy, I guess to borrow kind of a cliche phrase, to that client so that they feel good about themselves as you're photographing?
Yeah, absolutely. I think silence is one of the worst things that can happen when you're shooting.
And you really do see it happen. I mean, I'm watching it happen right nearby us at this moment. And granted, these are not shoots with clients, but I think that's a habit that can easily be picked up. You absolutely need to engage with the subject because they have no idea what you're looking at, what you're trying to shoot or not shoot, what looks good, what doesn't, what works. And again, especially for a client who's uncomfortable with that lens pointing at them, you have to help them feel comfortable.
Absolutely. And I think I want to say it's cliche because I hear it so often, but it's so true. If you are unsure if you're actually communicating well, get in front of somebody else's camera.
Yes.
Take the dollars out of your pocket, hire somebody.
Yeah,
Don't
100%.
Ask a friend.
Yeah.
Ask a photographer who is not a friend. Go hire someone and stand in front of that camera, and you will know that when they are silent, you will feel insecure. Hands down. There's never been
you can't help but wonder what in the world's going on. Are they do they not like what they're seeing in the camera?
Or am I even doing this right? What do I do with my hands?
Exactly. Communication, it's huge. And it really could be an episode in of itself. Maybe we can come back to that another time, but I appreciate you sharing that. What would you say is the biggest lesson or toughest lesson even that you've learned so far in business? A relatively short amount of time. I mean, props to you for making it this far because a lot of photographers don't. But what's one of the toughest lessons that you've learned that's translated to doing something different?
I think for me, the hardest lesson that I had to learn was to include myself in my plans for my business. And when I say include myself, I mean, I typically, when I was growing my business, it was all about, okay, I need to book a certain amount. I need to make plans to book this amount in order to grow this business in all aspects. And so my focus was 100% on the business. And I thought that I was my business. So I think the hardest lesson for me to learn was that I, as an individual, have needs outside of my business. And that if I'm not including myself in those plans, if I'm not including my family in those plans, then my business will overrun my life.
That's a great way to put it, and it reminds me of something that we talk about quite a bit here on the podcast. It's the idea of a big picture view.
Yes.
So this big picture view, it's made up of personal and professional goals. Part of those are financial in nature. For me, and what I encourage our listeners to do is to include time goals in that, because it's one thing to say, hey, I want to make a certain amount of money, but it's another thing to consider how much time it's going to take to make that amount of money. But these two big ideas then translate, in addition to our strengths, our known strengths and interests, translate to what type of business model that we create, which then translates to how we spend our time. And having that kind of big picture awareness is important. But I love that you suggest the idea of including your significant other or your family, your kids, or otherwise in that planning process. I think that's really, really important. And again, I love that we keep teasing like what we're going to actually talk about, kind of our primary focus for today, burnout, this idea. But having that type of proactive mentality makes a big, big difference when it comes to creating space for ourselves too and minimizing the chance of burnout. So this is very good. We're coming back to that. I do have one other question for you, though.
Okay.
What is a favorite piece of gear in your gear bag? Do you have like a favorite camera that you just recently picked up, or a lens or an accessory of some kind? What's a favorite?
It's interesting, actually. So I'm a Canon girl, but I have been being wooed by Sony. I mean,
yes.
It looks incredible, and I just have been thinking so hard about switching over. But I would say the Sigma Art 35 that I just picked up, shockingly, I'm like in love with it. I think it's a beautiful lens, and I think that just I've been able to be a little bit more creative with it than I have before, because I feel like typically, especially working with seniors and dancers, I loved my 70-200. I love my 85.
Yeah.
You know, I feel like I haven't really used a wider angle lens that often for portraiture, and I think that it's been interesting. I've really enjoyed working with it.
You said shockingly or startlingly so. Why would you say that?
I think
because
of that, always like I'm like, okay, if I'm Canon, I'm gonna be Canon all the way.
Yeah,
you know,
yeah.
And so picking up a different brand lens has been really interesting too, because I think a lot of times we look at things that might cost a little bit less and we're wary, because I'm one of those people that I'm like, well, you get what you pay for, you know. But it's a really reasonably priced lens, and it's beautiful. I've loved it.
Sigma, and I'm thinking back because it's been a few years, to be honest. I'm going to share kind of shine a little bit of light on my age at this point, but there was a lens that we were using for the longest time in our photography business, which was a Sigma. It was an 18-105, if I remember correctly, but it had a really nice focal length, but it was a Sigma lens. Again, my memory is betrays me at times, but my point simply being that ultimately going to a so-called off-brand lens has its benefits. And if you do the comparisons these days too, especially the quality of hardware that's coming out of these companies, I know that the Sigma Art lenses have carried a lot of momentum, a lot of popularity as of late. Yeah. But doing a quick comparison, I think opens up possibilities. I picked up, and I always get the pronunciation of this wrong, but is it Younghao? The flashes, but you know what I'm talking about.
Yeah,
and
I actually use those flashes myself.
Have you? Okay, yeah. Amazing for, whatever they are, $70 a piece.
Yes.
So
I
inexpensive.
use them every wedding. They're incredible.
Yeah. So I think we have access to a wide variety of hardware out there that doesn't necessarily have to be just Canon or just Nikon or even Sony for that matter. And it's fun to experiment and play. I mean, we can get carried away with that, but it's fun to experiment with that stuff. All right, so we've been teasing this topic of burnout, but of throughout our conversation at this point. One of the things that, and I said this earlier, but we've kind of touched on the idea of burnout before, how to deal with it when it's happened. I like the idea of being a bit more proactive in dealing with it or addressing the topic before it happens. But you're obviously very passionate about all of this, and so we have to hear the backstory. Like what happened that made you so interested in this topic, and did it happen kind of in between careers or after you started in photography? What's the backstory?
Yeah, so actually, I mean, speaking back on my life as a teacher, I thought that was going to be my forever career. And when I picked up photography, I thought, this is a really great side hustle. It's so much fun. It ties in. I'm really enjoying it. And as my business grew, my workload at work did not go down at all. So I was essentially working 2.5 full-time jobs because I was still coaching.
Yeah. Okay.
So as a coach and a dance director, a full-time teacher at a public school, and any public school teachers out there know that it's not just the classroom work. You have so much paperwork and so many meetings, and it's just nonstop work. I mean, the myth of summers off, I think, is laughable. So I just never anticipated that much of a workload taking such a toll on me. And so I found myself, I can remember very clearly the day that I decided to quit my job. I remember looking in the mirror, and I had these terribly huge black circles under my eyes, and I looked at my husband and I just started sobbing, and he was like, "You don't even look like yourself anymore. You don't, you're like," it was almost like I was a shell, because I had given and given and given so much of myself to my students, to my clients. To be quite frank, I felt like my husband will fight me, but I felt like I was a terrible wife. I felt like I wasn't a good sister. I wasn't a good daughter. I wasn't a good friend. And so we talked about it that morning before work. And he said, "Listen, I think that you either need to put the business away and just teach, or you need to, take this jump and see where your business can go and stop teaching, but you've got to make a choice."
Okay.
And so that was devastating for me. I loved my students dearly, and I still do, and I loved my job. So that was a really tough transition. And what's worse is that I went into my business. Things were going great. My business was doing exactly what I wanted to do. I was hitting all these goals. I was, a year in, everything was awesome. And I thought, surely now it's going to be great. I'm making my own schedule.
Right.
Who could ever burn out when you're making your own schedule?
One would think, yes.
Yeah. And so I got to that point again where I was up editing until 2 a.m, never seeing my husband, not taking care of myself. My health was deteriorating. I felt awful because I went from a job where I was dancing for 8 hours a day, super physically active, to I would have a few shoots a week, but then I was sitting and editing and answering emails and coming up with marketing plans. And I started mentoring, and even that was sitting and at a computer. And so it was just, I was starting to burn out, and I thought, I can't run this business anymore. And that's when I was like, okay, this is a cycle, and it's a cycle that can be broken, and I'm choosing not to break it. And so that's when I started getting really passionate about preemptively avoiding burnout.
Which is a beautiful segue. Like, we should just dive right in here. I know that you've got a couple of ideas that you want to share that you've ultimately learned from experience, right? I mean, you go through this process, and I think it's elements of the story anyway, probably most of our listeners can relate to in one form or another. At one point in time in their career as photographers, they felt absolutely drained, a shell of themselves, as you described earlier. So what are the big ideas that drive an effort to proactively avoid this burnout? Because I think, and again, so much of our podcast centers around these ideas that enable us to minimize the amount of busy work and the innate stress to that busy work, the heavy load which is running a business. What are those ideas that have enabled you to kind of step beyond that?
I love this. I think that the number one thing I can suggest is reevaluate your why.
Okay.
Because I think in the beginning, when we start our businesses, we are told time and time again, what's your why? Start with your why. Make sure you're working from your why. And I think, especially at, we're sitting here at Show It United. And so I think like this community that we're in right now, it's very much serving others. And so I think a lot of us start with our why being, it's to, for example, a wedding photographer will say, my why is to capture these amazing memories for this couple to treasure for their whole lives, and to serve them on their day, before their day, after their day, and to be there for them, to eliminate stress from their day, and it's a service-based industry. That's what we do, is we serve others. Sure. And so I think that in the beginning, it's a beautiful sentiment, and it's a really beautiful place to start from. But after a certain point, when you're working nonstop and you're up till 2 a.m, your why has got to start to include you. So I think going back and looking at your first why, I started my business because, and then reevaluating and say, I run my business now because, and seeing what those things are. I think every business owner who has walked a journey will be able to say, okay, my why has slightly altered. It's grown and it's evolved. So for me, I would say in the beginning, I started my business because I wanted to empower these girls and make them feel great about themselves. And I still feel that way. But now I run my business to, yes, continue to serve these wonderful young women that I work with and these couples that I work with. But it's also to provide a life of freedom so that I can spend time with my husband and my parents and go home, because my family lives far, and go home and see my niece and nephew whenever I want. Or if there's a crisis in my family, be able to go home for an extended period of time, and my business will still run itself, and I can still pay my mortgage. Right. Those are okay. Like being able to include yourself in your why is not selfish. It's self-aware.
I like that. I like that distinction. That's brilliant. And I don't think I've heard it quite worded that way before. So very, very well done. Well communicated.
Thank you.
But this again plays on the idea that we were talking about earlier, the big picture view. And I think it's easy, and I know I can speak from personal experience. When I started my photography business, I didn't have a why. I didn't have a big picture view. I didn't know what my goals were for the next year and 3 years, 5 years, 10 years down the road. And I certainly wasn't very self-aware. So I think this is something that a lot of photographers can probably relate in one form or another. The idea of kind of haphazardly starting a photography business, knowing that's what they wanted to do, but not really understanding what they're actually reaching for, And so they're just kind of taking a little bit of this and a little bit of that. And next thing they know, they're just slammed, quote, busy. But really, a lot of that is just a reaction to this haphazard business model that they've created. So I think, first of all, it's good not only to understand or to make sure that the why includes a personal element, which gives you space to take care of yourself and your family if you have a family. But just the simple idea that you would have a why to begin with is something that is a good reminder for all of us, particularly our listeners, because there is a tendency in our industry to just jump right in without having not just, I want to be a photographer, that's a why, sure, but a deeper meaning that drives what we do day to day. So starting with that is important, but then including the personal side to that is really, really important, and the self-awareness necessary for that. You may have to take a little bit of time to think about what that why could be, but having that self-awareness is very important as well. So that's a really great, very powerful first idea. Share what that other big idea is that's kind of driving this, really an effort to avoid the burnout that a lot of us, I think, can relate to.
Yeah, so my second idea, my second really big concept that I harp on a lot is learning to identify red flags. And for me, I hear a lot. You can use the word trigger. You can use the word red flag. You can say indicator. Being able to identify that you're burning out before you burn out is one of the most difficult things that you can do for yourself. But it's also, I think, one of the most important. So, for example, I use the example of outsourcing, which actually is really fitting because I feel like a lot of people wait until they're sitting behind their computer 20 sessions behind, paralyzed with guilt and fear and just anxiety and crying at their computers before they outsource. Well, you can't just immediately email out photos. I mean, it takes a minute to get that system set up. So being able to preemptively do that at a point where you're like, okay, well, I've booked this many sessions. I might get a little overwhelmed when I'm trying to edit, And so being able to identify that red flag of I've overbooked myself in order to prevent overwhelming myself, I need to put a little bit of action into play here. I'm
so glad you bring this up because this is a conversation that I've even heard since I've been here at the conference. This idea that an editing company is a solution for an emergency versus it being a solution, a global solution for an element of your business, right? Which is we need to have post-production. I mean, the post-production is a necessary element of our business. It has to get done. The question, of course, is how it gets done. We can take it on ourselves and we can maintain control and play the role of the quote artist in that. Or we can still be an artist as a photographer, create beautiful images, but delegate that work to somebody else, whether it's an in-house assistant or a third-party company like Photographers Edit or otherwise. There are plenty of solutions there. But it requires the kind of bigger picture thinking, which is, okay, this thing isn't making me, editing my own images isn't making me money. It's eating up so much of my time, probably the largest percentage of time of anything that we have to do in our business.
Absolutely.
And so learning to give that thing up, and it takes a little bit of time. You mentioned the investment in time that it does take. It's a good thing to do to start during off season.
Oh, yes.
Again, another time when photographers tend to avoid it, they think, I'm not, quote, busy, I can just do it myself. But it's important to go ahead and set it up during the slower season so that when you do get into busy season, you now have that taken care of. You don't have to stress out about it in the moment because you have 20 sessions backed up. So absolutely. I love that you bring that up.
Yeah, I mean, I think it's the same on the same level as being able to identify. If you struggle to identify things intrinsically, being able to recognize external cues. For example, a lot of times my friends would be like, well, you have said no to seeing me for months.
Wow.
You got to slow down, girl.
Yeah.
And I would almost get defensive. Or my husband would be like, you're becoming a little bit of a workaholic. And by becoming, I mean, he probably said, you're a straight up workaholic. I'm trying to be a little bit kind in this reenactment here. But I really was. And I think that it was hard for me to see that because I want so badly to be fiercely protective of my business and what I've grown. And we want to take pride in our work. And so I think we become very quickly defensive of when other people are trying to cue us in on those red flags. So I think just being able to take a step back, look at the big picture and say, these people might actually have a point here. They might be right. I might need to take some action. I might need to grow my team. I might need to think about outsourcing, and that's when you start taking steps forward, as opposed to I'm going to wait until I'm like laying on my bathroom floor sobbing with my husband in the other room being like, okay, it's time to quit your job. You know?
Yeah. No, it's true. It is easy to get caught up in the busyness of it, and then we're stuck, highly stressed out, and the scene that you're describing on the bathroom floor crying, or whatever it might be, whatever your version of it is, that it's easy to get into that space if we don't take preemptive action. And I love this, starting with understanding the why behind what we even do in the first place, and making sure that an element of that why, that big picture view, it includes us. It includes what we want for ourselves on a personal level, for our significant others in our lives. That's important. Identifying the red flags, it requires self-awareness,
absolutely,
which is multiple conversations in and of itself, but then also a willingness to kind of set ego aside and take feedback from those closest to us and say, hey, you're not, kind of the way that you described earlier, you're a shell of yourself. When your husband said that, you're not yourself, this is what you're doing, and being open-minded enough to take that feedback and make change is good. And I think preemptively, again, with those close relationships, even telling, whether it's our significant other or our close friends or family, hey, please let me know. I'm working my butt off here. I'm trying to build something. If I'm not myself, if I'm getting so carried away that I'm not connecting with you all, just give me a heads up.
Yeah.
That kind of communication, I think, would probably make that process easier too.
Absolutely. I mean, it's another form of accountability. I feel like a lot of times in business, we're like, oh, I need an accountability buddy to keep me on track with my goals. And it's like, well, maybe you need an accountability buddy to keep you on track with your life.
That's good. And I think it's a great way to kind of sum up our conversation too here. I would love for you to share with our listeners where they can find you online, your website, social media. They may be curious to kind of follow what you're doing and see some of your work. What are those? Yeah,
you can find me pretty much anywhere at Laylee Emadi. So on Instagram, I'm at Laylee_Emadi. I know it's a lot to...
And go ahead and spell it out for our listeners too, if you will.
Laylee, and there's not a lot of me out there, so
no, yeah.
You can pretty much find me based on the first name. And then my website is just LayleeEmadi.com.
And that's EMADI, correct?
EMADI, yep.
Perfect. Yeah, I know. I'm in a similar boat. If I search Holritz, I think there are all of maybe 10 of us, literally 10 families in the whole U.S. or something like that. It's kind of, it makes us unique, but then you always get the weird pronunciations of the names, and I'm sure you've had plenty of this. It's the spelling and the pronunciation
that's rough, but it's nice to be easily found.
Fair enough. Well, I'm glad that we've had this conversation. I really appreciate you making time to share with Bokeh. Maybe we can do a round 2 at some point in time. I think we've touched on multiple topics here that we could dive into more. But thank you so much for making time for the Bokeh Podcast today.
Thank you so much for having me. This is fun.
Absolutely. Thanks so much for listening to the Bokeh Podcast today. Will you let us know what you think by leaving a review of the podcast in iTunes or maybe in the Apple Podcast app? And I'd love to hear from you personally with your thoughts about the podcast, maybe suggestions about future topics and guests for the show. My direct email is nathan@photographersedit.com. The Bokeh Podcast is brought to you by Photographers Edit, custom image editing for the wedding and portrait photographer. Just visit photographersedit.com.